has a happy ever after. And after this story, there's an after party.
Hello, and welcome to Happy Ever After Party. I'm your host, Sam Logston. Amanda Pierce is going to be joining me in the next episode, and I wanted to start by apologizing for not having a cast last week. I've been dealing with some health issues. Amanda's been dealing with some problems outside of recording herself, and, we just want to thank you all for still showing up, being supportive, and, coming back to listen to us every week. We both really and sincerely couldn't do this without you guys, so thank you. Now, on to the subject at hand. There's been a lot of news lately about a particular author who's known for writing a particular series of books, who has a very distinct flavor of bigotry, and whose new book, about to be released, features that bigotry right in the description of the book. Now, I'm not going to mention this author or the series she is known for, because that would be giving her attention. And any kind of attention, positive or negative, is going to give her more traction on the internet and more reason for people to keep her relevant. And I want to keep her as irrelevant as possible. Granted, her particular flavor of bigotry would be trans-exclusive radical feminists, otherwise known as TERFs, and TERFs affect my livelihood and the livelihood of a lot of my friends. As a non-binary person, they tend to think of me as a lost lesbian sister, which I am not. And some of my friends, they find to be a little bit more dangerous, which again, they are not. So, needless to say, I don't even necessarily want to dwell on her. Instead, I want to talk about the concept of leaving fandoms, what you can do, and we're going to start why you should, or in some cases shouldn't. There are many different fandoms that exist. If you think about it, anything from Star Wars and Star Trek, to horror enthusiasts, to certain cartoon and comic enthusiasts, both in the graphic novel sense and for children's cartoons. Fandoms for certain series of books, fandoms of music. And what kind of unifies the idea of fandom, instead of just being a regular fan or patron, is the sense of community. For example, I enjoy Star Trek, but I wouldn't consider myself to be part of the fandom, because the people who I surround myself with aren't all Trekkies. I don't necessarily engage with the Star Trek fandom too much, just because I don't necessarily need a community to be as enthusiastic about Star Trek as I am, which I'm like more than lukewarm, but I'm not quite boiling. For a fandom, the media almost comes secondary in some cases. Fandoms have a tendency to get a reputation for being toxic, and trust me, there are some fandoms that are straight up toxic. But if we kind of shove those to the side, the fact that you are part of some fandom makes you compatible with people who are in other fandoms. Not necessarily because the media is related. For example, if you like Star Trek, you tend to get along with people who really like Doctor Who. The material can be compared if you want to, but the idea that you like something that is sci-fi and you engage with dressing up or the fan art or even the fan fiction, that's something that you and another person can celebrate together, because it's using that media as a catalyst for your creativity and to celebrate the creativity of others. The horror fans, which I would probably say, yeah, I'm kind of guilty of being in that group. It's great to be around people who more or less aren't afraid to express Schadenfreude or are really into special and practical effects. And, what makes horror or thriller, are those different or are they intertwined? You can get into some really interesting, deep philosophical discussions after watching movies like Halloween or Nightmare on Elm Street or any of their incarnations. So fandoms themselves are more than the material. They are more than the author. But the sad reality is that when you engage in media, you are financially supporting that author. Or if they are dead, you're financially supporting whoever has the rights to them. Which, that's a topic I don't feel as qualified to get into right now. So I'm going to focus primarily on those who are alive. We'll get to the dead ones in a little bit. If the creator of whatever your fandom is in suddenly starts saying things that are hurtful and are actively platforming themselves to champion against very marginalized and vulnerable members of certain communities, you might have to withdraw your support or choose not to support them and engage in the material in a way that doesn't give them any money. And sometimes that's a little bit easier said than done. So, what do you do? Well, first, you have to determine why you want to leave. If you, for example, are really into a certain series of books, and these are books that help form your personality in middle school, sometimes it's really hard to say goodbye to those. But if those same books that, helped formed you contain a lot of things that are against gay folk, against trans folk, racist, imperialist, classist, well, you may need to look elsewhere for your personality because you're not in middle school anymore. You've developed into your own person and you can look back on the text fondly, but if the people in your life mean more to you than those books, then you're leaving the fandom for the right reasons. If you don't really have anybody for whom that bigotry affects, and you want to leave to show your support, even better. That's awesome. That means you have empathy. If you want to leave the fandom because if somebody knows you like it and engage with it, they might ridicule you, and you don't want that, well, I mean, it's a reason to leave, but if you really don't want to and that's your only reason, you might want to ask yourself why people would ridicule you. You might need to look at that a little bit deeper. Really examine why someone's bigotry instilled in that book means more to you than using your money and using your time spent reading something elsewhere to somebody who maybe needs that support more, instead of somebody who's already, quite frankly, profited off of this long ago and would be fine if she got no more support. So that's step one. Really examining yourself and understanding why you want to leave. So, number two, you've already decided that this creation, whatever it is, you no longer want to support it, but you really miss engaging with the fans. You miss your community, you miss your tribe. Well, here's where things can get a little bit fun and interesting and not entirely bleak and preachy. Look for people who make fan art of that product who may be the targets of that bigotry, using something that I enjoy that I am well aware is problematic. I told you that we'd get to a dead person. I really enjoy the works of H.P. Lovecraft, but I'm also well aware of how problematic of a person he is, or was, I should say. Now, there's probably going to be a lot of people who, when listening to this, are going to chime in with, well, he was just a man of his time. My air quotes really, really are big on this one. You're just going to have to believe me. And here's the thing, you might be right. He may have just been influenced by the people around him to use certain descriptions and certain words because that's just what was being done. And he may never have had somebody to show him that, well, whiteness isn't the only superior option. Whiteness isn't superior, period. Or he may have literally believed that, white people were superior. And honestly, one way or the other, it doesn't matter because the material still hurts people who aren't white. So getting hung up on those details kind of doesn't matter. But it for me, I still enjoy the work and I still try to distance myself from reading the material. Like the one book that I have of him is something that I got from a used bookstore. So it wasn't even necessarily money going towards whoever owns the rights to H.P. Lovecraft. It went to Bradley's. That's where my money went. All $2 of it. Looking for alternatives to buying straight from the source really help. There are a lot of Black and Indigenous people of color who enjoy Lovecraft. Jordan Peele is one of them. He currently has a series on HBO that prominently features Black actors and Black issues in Lovecraft country. And that is something that you should totally watch, because this is something created by a person who would have normally been hurt by that bigotry, taking that material, putting their own twist on it, and making it his own. Jordan Peele is exceptionally good at this, especially when it comes to horror. You should just check out all of his work. I mean, I always liked Key and Peele and their comedy. I always thought that they were hilarious. And I feel like a lot of what it takes to be a good comedian can be transferred into horror, because both comedy and horror rely so much on tension and anticipation that if you can nail it, you in either one of those pots, you can nail the other one too. And Peele definitely delivers on that. Kind of going back to like fan art, people who aren't necessarily already in Hollywood, but your favorite Etsy creators. Think about all of your wood carving, painting, thumbnail making, claymation, t-shirt making, knit and crocheting fan art people. Why not support them? Especially regarding She Who Is Not to Be Named. That series of books was really influential to a lot of trans and non-binary people. And I think it would be rather poetic if you were to maybe still enjoy the imagery from that, but you're buying from somebody who normally would be the target of that bigotry, but is instead profiting off of it. That to me is beautiful. That is poetry. I love that. Now, moving on to our third step. Let's say you just want to divorce from it altogether, but you're still struggling to fill that hole, to fill that void. And the easiest thing for you to do in that particular case is just to start with the genre. As somebody who likes horror, it's really easy for me to avoid more problematic people because so many people have done horror. I know for some critics, there usually bounces back and forth this idea that horror by nature is very sexist. But women, AFAB folk, queer folk, tend to really like horror, and there's a lot of us who've produced it. You know? It's just a quick little Google search away. There's a really good horror anthology, XX. I believe it is on Hulu and Netflix as of time of recording. That's all done by women. Me and Amanda have talked about Ravenous before. American Mary, American Psycho. You know, there's a lot of material out there that goes against the grain of the criticisms certain genres have. And in the She Who Is Not to Be Named series, people tend to think about fantasy and fiction being overtaken by a bunch of cis, straight, white men. And that's true if you haven't been looking elsewhere. If you're not actively looking for an alternative, you are going to miss them. I've mentioned them before. Jessie from Bow Ties and Books. I will put a link for that in the description of this video. They do a bunch of great fiction and fantasy reviews for people of all different nationalities, of all different orientations and identities, like a lot of really good Black and Indigenous people of color, queer fantasy and fiction. Like that's everything right now. I think that's the kind of positivity and hope we need for the genre if we don't want to continue making the same mistake of falling for people who entice us with something that we've seen and heard before. It could be very comforting, but do have an agenda underneath. Now, that's not to say that She Who Is Not to Be Named was always pushing that agenda. I think some of her values have seeped into the works, and maybe over time they got a little bit more apparent. There's nothing necessarily insidious about it until you start peeling back those layers. And I think with a lot of people, it never starts off as an insidious thing. I think it always starts with wanting to write a book and not realizing how your reality shapes your fiction. Lindsay Ellis, who I will also put a link for in the description, did a wonderful video on basically what I'm talking about right now with this particular author in mind. You know, she mentioned Tolkien, who we can also put down as like, he was a product of his time, non-defense. You know, it's not really a defense. It really isn't, because people have always criticized white supremacy and sexism and gender hegemony throughout history. Like, these are not new concepts, and anyone who thinks so, like, I don't know what to tell you. You should probably stop learning from statues and start learning from a book. An author is always informed by the world around them. So when you have a collection of people who come from all these different backgrounds, your fantasy is going to start to look a lot more interesting. It's going to start to look a lot different. It's going to be inspired maybe by the likes of Tolkien and H.P. Lovecraft, but it's going to blossom into this new fantastic world that the broader audiences were probably never exposed to. And again, you're not going to be exposed to them if you don't actively look for them. And a really good place to start is with people who engage with that material. So that's why I really like Jessie and their works. So if that was step 3, sub A, I do want to bring attention to step 3, sub B. And that has to do with reviewers. If the reviewers you're looking at don't have a whole lot of diversity, you're probably not going to find a diversity of books or movies or TV shows or music that you would like to listen to. For a very brief example of how a lack of diversity in the people you listen to for recommendations can affect your tastes, let's see here. There's a lot of white dudes that are out there on the internet, and I like some of them. Some of them are the guys from Red Letter Media. And I remember them talking about Black Panther when it first came out. And they liked the movie, but they made this really weird comment about the culture in Wakanda and how advanced Wakanda was, but still had all of these primitive clothes on, and how they engaged with rituals in a certain way. And it's not like it was outright offensive, but it seemed like really, really bizarre to me how Western culture as we know it, and as advanced as it is, still has people going to church, you know? And what Black Panther was, what Wakanda was in that movie, was what if Western culture, quote unquote, was not shaped by white Anglo-Saxon tastes. And I think it did a really good job in representing that. And to sort of just brush it off as like primitive or like tonally dissonant, I think is very uninformed of how history was shaped. That's just my very humble opinion anyway. I'm not going to dwell on it for too long. And like, full disclosure, I still love you, Red Letter Media. Please have me be on your show. But I think you could probably do a little bit better with introspection. So let's recap. All right. You have a beloved series and you find out that your author has betrayed you with their bigotry. What do you do about it? Well, step one, really understand why you're leaving the fandom in the first place, and if it's something that you truly want to do and know that it's the right thing, you're in good hands. Step two is finding out ways that you can enjoy the material without financially supporting that person, that creator. Look to the fan art. Look for people who pretty heavily base their work on the work that you like, but have their own unique twist on it. And this is something that I didn't mention. Libraries are your friend. If you go to libraries to engage in that material, you are not financially supporting the people who are still alive, and you're not really generating any interest in the people who are dead. If you're really having trouble letting go, that's a relatively safe option. Step 3. Actively look for people who write in the genre that are a lot more diverse than the people you've already been looking at. And same thing with the reviewers. Now that's a pretty good list so far of how to divorce yourself from fandoms, but I want to add what's probably a bonus step, but one that I wholeheartedly support. And that's step 4, create your own. Not everybody has the means to create books or movies or TV, but if you want to engage with fan art or self-publishing, or if you have the time to sit down and write scripts and hopefully try to get people to read it or produce it, that's pretty awesome. If you know community colleges or theaters who would want to engage with whatever works you have, go ahead, shoot for the stars. Aim for that. I support you. Well, I think a lot of other people would too. I mean, there's certain things that are out there that, you know, are made by and for certain people, and that's beautiful. I'm okay with the fact that there's material that was not meant for people like me to watch. And that's okay. Because I might feel alienated, but it was probably created by somebody who's felt alienated their entire life. Something that was kind of maddening to me about the movie A Quiet Place. I enjoyed it, but they had subtitles for the parts where people were speaking sign language, but not the parts that were spoken out loud. And it's so bizarre to me that you could introduce a concept like featuring deafness and sign language prominently in your movie without really being considerate to the people who use it. Like, you're so close to hitting the nail and you hit the wall instead. It's stuff like that I'd really like to see people try to make better and try to be produced by people of that demographic. I think if you have the ability, or if you have people who can help you get the ability to produce the kind of stuff you want to make, you should absolutely do it. I mean, that's why I have this podcast. That's not to say that there aren't AFAB and NB folk who don't do review shows and stuff like that. You know, they exist. We exist. But there's not nearly as many of us out there as I would like to see. And I think being a part of a network that allows me to use my voice, no matter who I am, is a really cool thing. And I thank Matt and Insensitive Network for doing that. But, you know, I want to see more diversity out there. And I think podcasts are definitely starting to have that diversity, but we need to promote more. And we need to help support people who aren't being recognized. So I think in a time where a lot of people are essentially mourning a fandom that's been so cherished and so formative, I think now is a really good time to leave it and find another tribe. Well, I'm Sam Logston, and I want you all to remember that it may not be the end, it may not be happy, but you are always welcome to this party. Take care.